The Charles River Museum's Mill Talk series is made possible by a grant from the Lowell Institute and by the support of our museum members. To become a member, visit charlesrivermuseum.org/join. To follow us here on YouTube, click subscribe and hit like if you enjoyed this video.
Good evening. Dr. Heim Rosenberg is an extraordinary gentleman who first was committed to a career in medicine as a practicing psychiatrist and is now a prolific American history researcher and writer, concentrating on industrial history and mostly that history of our New England region. This journey through his present scholarly career has led Dr. Rosenberg inadvertently into a position of profound importance to us here at the Charles River Museum. We are the stewards of the legacy of our home here, now known as the Francis Cabot Lowell Mill, originally the Boston Manufacturing Company, which is said to be the first integrated textile mill in the world and the model for industrial scale organization and manufacturing that is a global standard even today, more than 2 centuries on. The Boston Manufacturing Company was founded by Francis Cabot Lowell in 1813 and led directly to the explosive growth of textile manufacture in New England in the first half of the 19th century. Legendary mill cities like Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts, Manchester and Nashua, New Hampshire, and Biddeford and Saco, Maine were based on this pioneering Waltham model. Francis Cabot Lowell is our hero here, and Heim Rosenberg wrote the book on him quite literally with his biography, The Life and Times of Francis Cabot Lowell. John Lowell Jr. was Francis Cabot Lowell's eldest son. Rather than enter the textile industry, John chose to go to sea early on and worked actively in the family's shipping business. John Lowell Jr. is best known, however, for a profound and enduring philanthropic act, directing in his will that a large portion of his considerable estate provide free lectures forever in the city of Boston. That extraordinary legacy is dynamically manifest today in the Lowell Institute, which was established in 1836 and underwrites distinguished lecture series at institutions throughout Greater Boston, including the Boston Public Library, the Kennedy Library, the Museum of Science, the Ford Hall Forum, Cambridge Forum, and the Old South Meeting House. The Lowell Institute and its trustees for getting near 2 centuries are also responsible for establishing the Boston Athenaeum, Harvard Extension School, and WGBH Radio and Television, and more. Dr. Heim Rosenberg's latest book is entitled John Lowell Jr. and His Institute, The Power of Knowledge, and it is the subject of tonight's talk. With deep gratitude to the Lowell Institute for sponsoring our lectures as well, it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Heim Rosenberg.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's a great pleasure for me to be back at the Charles River Museum. I've been here 2 or 3 times before talking about one or other members of the Lowell family. It's been a fascinating interest of mine for many years. As Bob said a few moments ago, I wrote the book about Francis Cabot Lowell and about 15 years ago, and then a few years ago I decided to try to write a book about his son, who in his own way did something equally remarkable. The father built this very mill here, one of the first water-powered mills in the United States, and sort of set the Industrial Revolution going in America. His son was a pioneer in the adult education movement, and in his own way was as significant as his father. So who are the Lowells, and who is John Lowell Jr.? This is an unexpected picture of John Lowell Jr., the son of Francis Cabot Lowell, taken, at least painted in 1835 in Alexandria, Egypt. He was on a tour on his way to China. I'll discuss this in more detail in a little while. But he took with him an artist called Glier, who was a Swiss artist. He found the artist in Rome and hired him to be the eyes and ears of his trip halfway around the world to China and then back again. Now, this is the age before the camera, before the photograph. So if you wanted to record something, you had to have an artist to do it for you. So in Rome, John Lowell Jr. hired Mr. Glier as his official photographer, his official painter, with instructions to paint scenes that he found interesting. And this particular painting was done in early 1835 when John Lowell Jr. arrived in Egypt. He's pictured in Egyptian garb smoking a hookah pipe. I don't know if it was addictive. I don't even know if he smoked it, but he wanted to look authentic, so he had himself painted in this way. So who is this man who was in Egypt in 1835 and then went on his way to as far as India, where he died at age 37? This is the Lowell family. So the Lowells are one of the oldest families in the United States. They arrived around 1635 and settled around Newburyport in Massachusetts. Why Newburyport? Because the governor of Massachusetts at the time was concerned about the French moving south from Montreal or Quebec and moving towards Massachusetts, so they wanted settlers to settle in Newburyport and further up to protect the English heritage of New England. And that's where the Lowells settled down and were for several generations farmers or carpenters or what have you, until this gentleman came up. He was the Reverend John Lowell, the first John Lowell to become a minister and the first one to graduate from Harvard. So he was a Harvard graduate, settled in Newburyport, lived his whole life there, and died in his 60s. His only son, John Lowell, many of them were called John Lowell, so even our subject is John Lowell, so you have to separate the John Lowells from the John Lowells. But this is John Lowell, the judge. He had the good fortune to be born just before the American Revolution and took part in the American Revolution. I wouldn't say he was a major character in the Revolution, but he certainly played a role. And he was a judge. He became a judge appointed by President Washington. And he lived until 1802, living in Bromleyvale in the Boston area. And his whole life was in New England. He was an esteemed lawyer and spent some of his time helping loyalists who had been deprived of their property, and his effort was to get the property back for them. So he became quite a wealthy fellow and had 3 wives. They all died pretty young, and had a total of 8 children, of whom Francis Cabot Lowell was one of them. And Francis Cabot Lowell, of course, is the father of our subject, John Lowell Jr. John Lowell, on the other side of the family, was Jonathan Jackson. And Jonathan Jackson was a Harvard roommate of Judge John Lowell. They were very close friends, and the children intermarried with the 2 families. In fact, Francis Cabot Lowell's wife was one of the children of Jonathan Jackson. If you want to see this picture, you can go to the Museum of Fine Arts. It's in the new American wing. It's a beautiful watercolor painting, and it's there on display. At least it was there the last time I looked. And it's in beautiful color. He was a very good-looking, handsome fellow who was quite vain in his appearance. And he had also a role in the American Revolution, which is worth noting. And he was the maternal grandfather of our subject, John Lowell Jr. Now here is the man for whom this mill is named, Francis Cabot Lowell. He was born in 1775, the year before the American Revolution. And he didn't know much of the Revolution, but he started life. He was a Harvard graduate. After that, his father set him up as a trader and a businessman in Boston. He made his fortune as a trader, trading goods from abroad and selling them in New England. And then he got waylaid a bit with the War of 1807, at least the blockade of 1807, which affected his business. So he decided in 1810 to go on a tour of Great Britain, and he took his family with him, including our subject, John Lowell Jr. So he went off to Europe, and the famous story, of course, is that he went there spying on the English and the British the water-powered textile mills, and brought the ideas back to America and started this very mill here in 1814. So that is a very significant trip that he took, and he went with his wife, first of all, to Manchester. From Manchester, they made their way to Scotland, and left the children in Scotland with Scottish people, while Francis Cabot Lowell and his wife, Hannah Jackson Lowell, she is the daughter of the Mr. Jackson that I talked about a few moments ago. They went on a tour of Great Britain and left the children behind in Scotland to be taken care of, mainly by a lady. I'll show you her picture, Mrs. Grey, in a few moments. The other important man in John Lowell's life was his uncle, John Lowell Jr., the son of Judge Lowell. He was called the Boston Rebel, a cantankerous, intelligent fellow who became a lawyer, who was very successful, took over his father's practice. He became involved in a famous trial in 1802 in Dedham, Massachusetts, where a young man called Fairchild had killed his girlfriend. He claimed that she had killed herself in a fit of lover's remorse. But the judge found out, the jury found out that this young man had killed his girlfriend and was hanged in Dedham court. The lawyer who was defending him was none other than John Lowell Jr., this fellow here. And he was so distressed by the fact that he lost the trial that he gave up the law completely, had what I would describe as a post-traumatic stress disorder, and took himself off on a trip to Europe to recover, which he took 4 years to do, and then came back to Massachusetts, became a big shot in the horticultural world, and wrote many pamphlets, mainly as a Federalist, and opposing the Virginians like Jefferson and the others there, and saying that the country should be united rather than being separated by the states. So this is the uncle of our John Lowell, also called John Lowell Jr. Now, on the other side of the equation is the Jackson family, who had several sons, all of whom were prominent. This particular son, James Jackson, was a physician. He became one of the leaders of the Massachusetts General Hospital. In fact, he was the physician who treated our subject, John Lowell Jr., when John Lowell was born, was very ill, was born prematurely, and this gentleman saw him through the crisis and made him into a robust young man. So he is an important, if you want to know something about American medical history, then look up this gentleman, James Jackson, uncle of our subject. And now another uncle, this is the brother of the doctor, is Patrick Tracy Jackson, who was identified as being the manager of this very mill here after it was established by Francis Cabot Lowell. Francis Cabot Lowell, as you know, built the mill around 1814, and he died 3 years later. And his legacy was taken over by Patrick Tracy Jackson, who is youngest brother-in-law, who ran the business. And in 1822, this gentleman, and as well as Mr. Appleton and others, went up to the Merrimack River because this mill had become too small for the amount of work that was getting in. The river is too small to provide the power to make the mill expand. So instead they went to a more powerful river called the Merrimack River and built the city of Lowell, named after Francis Cabot Lowell. So the connection between this mill and the city of Lowell and the mills, the great mills of Lowell and the great industrial city of Lowell was involved. This gentleman, Patrick Tracy Jackson, was one of the key people involved in making the transition from a smaller mill to a large industrial city with about 20 different cotton mills. Now, I mentioned before that the Lowell family, Francis Cabot Lowell, in 1810 packed his children up and his wife, and off they went to England. They went there before the War of 1812. And they were abroad for 2 years, and as said, they went to Manchester, and from Manchester they made their way up to Scotland, and they left their children in the care of Mrs. Anne Grant. Now, I looked her up this morning. Somebody has written a long story about her online, which is worth looking at. She had spent much of her youth in this area in America. Her father was a British Army officer. They had a farm somewhere here, but during the Revolutionary War, the Grants were given a hard time, so they went back to Scotland. She wrote a book called A Lady in America, describing her life in America. And that book became popular amongst many people in the United States, including the aunts of Francis Cabot Lowell. And when Francis Cabot Lowell decided to go to Scotland, the aunts wrote to this lady and said, please make sure that the women in the Lowell family get as rich an education in Scotland as the males in the family. So Susan Lowell, the sister of Francis Cabot Lowell, received a good education from this lady because she was a feminist in a way in the year 1810. So she's a Scottish lady worth looking up. So what happened to John Lowell, our subject, went to Scotland from age about 10 to 12. He came back to the United States. He wrote the examination for admission to Harvard, got into Harvard, one of about 22 students in his year. But he was very unhappy there. He didn't have friends. He was isolated, a little neurotic. His father said he was very disappointed in John Lowell's progress, and after 2 years took him out of college and sent him on a boat to Asia as a seaman. But as a privileged seaman, because he paid his own way, and he was a guy who was on the boats for 2 years and then came back to Massachusetts and roamed around for a couple of years until he met his future wife. Now, this is him at age 25, the time of his marriage. He married in 1825, and he was courting a cousin of his, who is this lovely young lady, Georgina Margaret Amory Lowell, who was a cousin of his, and she was 17 when he cast eyes on her, and he said he loved her at first sight. They secretly communicated with each other because the families didn't approve of quite of the relationship. He was about 5 years older than she was, and she was unsure about the relationship, so was advised by her uncle, John Lowell Jr., the uncle, not to marry for 2 years, but to have a 2-year engagement and to see how they got along. But they got along just fine. They were two very prissy people. She wished to be a writer. She wrote a lot of interesting stories, and some of which I've read with my wife in detail. And she wanted to present herself as an educated young woman who was engrossed in literature and had ideas of her own. So she would say to her future husband, "Don't hover too much over me. Don't try to own me. Keep your distance, but not too far." So she would give him instructions about being not too protective, but not ignoring her. And they had this sort of give and take relationship until they married. She was 19 when they married in 1825. She had 2 children, one named for herself. And the life of John Lowell Jr. seemed to be heading towards a wonderful direction. He settled down, was happily married, was trying to make himself some sort of personality in the Boston area, associated with the right people, and saw himself as a man on the upswing of life. And for their engagement, after their marriage, they went on a trip around New England, and part of the trip was a trip to Lowell, Massachusetts, to observe what his father had created before him. And he bought land in Lowell and built a house in Lowell with the intention of becoming a big shot in the textile industry. But that never happened because tragedy followed. From about 1828 until 1830, a series of deaths rocked his life. His wife died of scarlet fever. Both his daughters died, his brother died of tuberculosis, his sister died, and his aunt died. So this poor man, John Lowell Jr., at age 27, 28, was faced with a catastrophe. All his plans had become unstuck, and his wife and his children and his brother and his sister were all dead within 5 years. So he became pretty gloomy, depressed, and decided to escape the world and go off on a trip around the world, mainly to China, because he was a fan of Marco Polo, and he set himself the goal of replicating Marco Polo's trip to China, from Italy to China, but he had to get Italy first. So he packed up his goodies, got on a boat and headed for Europe, and spent the next 2 or 3 years touring Europe. He had pots of money. He had letters of credit from various banks, and he set himself out to tour the world and to head as far as China and then to come back. Whether he was depressed, we've read his diary. He wrote copiously letters to his family, as well as kept a diary, and he wrote, I would say, maybe 2,000 words a day. It's incredible how much he wrote. He hardly ever made a mistake. He hardly ever crossed out words. It's just a flow of information, one word after another, one sentence after another. And the diary is kept at the Athenaeum. It's hard to get to see it. You have to have a reason to see it. But if you want to devote the next 5 years, I would say it'll be interesting to read John Lowell's diary. The other parts of the John Lowell story, by the way, are at the Massachusetts Historical Society, that has not all, but a vast quantity of letters that John Lowell wrote to his wife, and she wrote back to him. And somebody along the way put the letters in sequence. So you have a letter he writes to his wife and a letter she writes back to him. So you can follow the dialogue over a matter of months and years. And it really is heartwarming to read the story of these two young people who become engaged, marry, and then face these tragedies in their life. And it's all recorded and written on rag paper, so that after 200 years, the letters are legible if you have good eyes. I couldn't read them. My wife read them all, and we came across some sad stories about the children becoming ill, and while we were reading these stories, the members of the staff of the Mass Historical Society were quietly crying. The stories were so sad. I'm still moved by that image. So here we have Georgina Margaret Amory Lowell dies, and her husband goes off on his great trip around the world. So he gets to Europe, and he's a man in his 30s, much in love, I think, with women, looking always for pretty women, and I'll show you some very pretty pictures that he had taken. While he was in Italy, he met a man called Glier, who was a Harvard-educated, Harvard-trained sculptor who went to work in Europe. And Lowell went up to him and said, "I'd like you to do a sculpture of Venus Victrix," and this is she. It's in the Athenaeum, near the entrance of the library. If you can get into the Athenaeum, ask to see this. It's there. It's I think quite stunning, done by this man Glier, who had been at Harvard around 1820 or so, and had a career as a sculptor. So in Italy, John Lowell Jr., our subject, meets up with an artist called Glier, Gleyre, who was an impoverished Swiss painter who was supposed to be quite good, and in fact he is very good. And he hired this painter to come with him on the trip to China with the expectation that the painter would paint things that John Lowell found interesting and worth recording. Again, this is the age before the camera, so before the photograph, so that if you wanted to record something, you'd hire an artist, if you had the money, of course, who would not only draw things, but also paint them in watercolor. So this guy, Glier, carried with him his watercolors, and he carried his pencils, and wherever John Lowell said, paint that or draw that, he would do it. the relationship turned sour after a while, like many relationships, but for a while he painted this. Now, this is, of course, the picture of the Parthenon in Athens. Now, I'm reading a book about the Turks and the Greeks, and that's another whole other story. But when this painting was done in 1833, Athens was a small derelict village. And all that was left of the glory of ancient Greece was the Parthenon. Now, the Parthenon had a frieze on top of it here that Lord Elgin who was then the American ambassador to Istanbul, had taken off the Parthenon. And if you want to see it, it's now in the British Museum. It's one of the greatest relics of history available. But this fellow, of his own volition, I guess with the agreement of the Turks, demolished the top of the Parthenon and took it off to England, where it now rests. The Greeks have been trying for 200 years to get it back, but so far without much luck. So this is all that remained of the history, of the great history of Greece, was these relics of the Parthenon. It's now been largely restored, but this is how it looked in 1833, captured by the painter Glier. And I said that Francis Cabot Lowell had an eye for beauty, and from Greece they went on to Eastern Europe, and from Eastern Europe they crossed the Bosphorus into Turkey. And these are pictures of young Turkish women that caught the fancy of Francis Cabot Lowell, and he had his painter paint them. And I may add, I've seen all these pictures. They are in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts. They're kept in a drawer. They haven't been taken out of there for heaven knows how many years. But they have all been restored. They've all been kept, and they are, I think, exquisite pieces of art. And I would hope one day, while I'm still alive, that the Museum of Fine Arts will have an exhibition of these glorious paintings of the tour of Francis Cabot, tour of John Lowell Jr. into Europe and into Egypt. Another young Turkish woman, 1833. Now, this is another painting of John Lowell in Mufti as an Egyptian, which is also in this collection. Now, the painter, John Lowell, was interested in Egyptian art and Egyptian antiquities, and these were some of the antiquities that they saw painted by Glier, and part of this collection I talked about. Another one. Now, these sculptures, they were all sent back to New England, and the family kept them for a number of years until the Lowells his brother died, and then it was given to the Art Institute, to the Museum of Fine Arts around 1874. And if you go to the Egyptian collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, they are there to this day. So these are some of the pieces that Lowell picked out. You know, in those days you'd go to an Egyptian historical site and you say, and there were people there who had dug up these heads and these pieces of art and were offering them for sale. And all you do is say, I'll give you so much, and then you picked it up and you took it. And some of them are pretty heavy, so he had them transported to New England, and they are now, as I said, in the Museum of Fine Arts. This is a beautiful piece. It's on display at the museum. Another. And so here is John Lowell in Egypt, and he's reminiscing about life. And sitting, looking at the temple in Thebes, he's thought to himself, what will I do with my money? And he wrote a will. And the will stipulated that he wants to leave his money. He wasn't expecting to die, but he wanted to leave his money to an institute to offer education to the mass of the people in Boston for free. That was his dream. And he wrote out his will, sent the will back to New England, and specified that if he were to die, he would like his brother-in-law, John Amory Lowell, the son of his uncle John Lowell, to run the Institute. Because John Amory Lowell was not only his brother-in-law, but his best friend and his first cousin. Now, I don't know too much about genetics, but the Lowells intermarried at a feverish rate with cousins, first cousins and second cousins. And from what I've read, they are none the worse for it because they seem to be bright generation after generation. But this was John Amory Lowell, who was then involved in the textile industry in Lowell and was given the possible position of being the first trustee and the only trustee of the Lowell Institute who had the power to spend the money in any which way that he chose. So the will was written, and our subject, John Lowell, went up the Nile River to Khartoum, decided to cross the desert on a camel in a heat of about 120 degrees, got himself extremely ill, was involved with arguments with his artist, who then left him, and on his own, with a retinue of servants on camels, made his way across the Sinai to a port on the Red Sea, and to make his way to India with the hope of getting treatment from the British physicians who are part of the British Raj. But he got as far as Bombay, as it was then called, and he died at age 37 and was buried somewhere in Bombay. So that's the end of John Lowell Jr., age 37, dead. His wife died five years before his children died. The whole of his line died, but his brother-in-law was very much alive, and his brother-in-law became the trustee of the Lowell Institute with instructions to educate the mass of the people. Now, where did the idea come from? Well, just one other aside, the brother-in-law was the director of the Boot Mill, the humongous mill in Lowell. If anyone has been there, you'll see it as one of the largest mills that was built in Lowell. And John Amory Lowell was the director of that mill, and he began to integrate the Lowell Institute with his work in the mills. Now, John Amory Lowell, this gentleman, served as the trustee of the Lowell Institute for almost 50 years. So he's the man who fashioned the Institute. Now, where did the idea come from? If you lived in 1780 or 1900, 1780 or 1800, the only education available were the few universities in Harvard, Yale, a few others around the country, and the mass of the people had almost no education. Most people had, at best, a grade school education, and some people, starting in England, had the idea that unless you educated the masses, they would rise up against the state and cause a revolution. So the best way to modify or pacify people was to educate them. Now, the first guy in New England was Josiah Holbrook, who came from Connecticut. He had the idea of what he called the Lyceum movement, was to offer education to the mass of people, and that people who had a skill would teach the skill to other people, so that if there were 10 people in a class, each person would have a turn to show off his or her skill, men and women. And the first place they tried out this idea was in this very mill, where there were lots of farm girls who had come to work on the machines in the mill, and they were eager for education, and the Lyceum movement was offering education to them. The other source was a British movement which was called the the diffusion of useful knowledge. It was a movement to educate ordinary people at a university level, but not in a university. So John Lowell, our subject, John Lowell Jr., when he wrote his will to establish the Lowell Institute, was motivated by the Lyceum movement and by the idea of trying to help to educate the mass of the people, to make them educated and to have a stake in the Industrial Revolution. And one of the big issues of the day, of course, was the extent to which God had a plan, or whether science was independent of religion. And that discussion went on for about 30 or 40 years until, of course, the Charles Darwin story about the evolution, and that sort of gave the scientific side of the equation a boost, and the Lowell Institute went in that direction as well. So this is Josiah Holbrook, the founder of the Lyceum movement in New England. It became a nationwide movement to educate the masses. So when the Lowell Institute began, there was the Lyceum movement, there was the movement to diffuse information, and there was the Lowell Institute. And the question was, which one would win out? Well, clearly, it was the Lowell Institute that won for many reasons. One, it had an excellent director, John Amory Lowell, and two is they paid $100 a lecture. Now, in those days, an average workman would make $250 a year. And if you gave 10 lectures or 12 lectures, that was equivalent to a year's salary even for a professor. So the Lowell Institute was able to hire the most prominent lecturers, not only in New England, not only in America, but coming from English-speaking, and in fact from European countries as well, who were willing to come all the way to Boston to lecture, and to lecture on science, to lecture on religion, to lecture on anatomy, on physiology, on a whole variety of subjects, because they knew they were going to get a good audience, and they knew they would be well paid, and the people who came from Europe would earn enough money to tour America for a year on the basis of the Lowell Institute payments. So money did talk, and it attracted the most famous lecturers of the day, American and foreign. So, and the other movements, like the Lyceum movement, began to fade because they could not compete. They were paying $10 a lecture, which could not compete with what the Lowell Institute was able to offer. So John Lowell Jr., when he died, and this is the book I wrote about him, if you can see it, he left $250,000, which is equivalent to about $10 million today. And I think the Lowell Institute has more money today than by investments, but it was able to pay decent wages to people, decent sums of money to people to lecture, and people came from all over the world to lecture in Boston. One of the people involved in early adult education was Senator Daniel Webster, who became a Secretary of State. He was a very prominent lawyer, a very prominent senator, and a man of great consequence in this area. And he was one of these people involved in boosting adult education. This is a lovely picture, I think, of the Salem. There are few lyceums left. There's one, I think, in Concord, and there's one in Salem, Massachusetts. And this is a picture of Graham Bell in 1877 or thereabouts, demonstrating his telephone at the Lyceum in Lowell. A pretty historic event. So let's go back to John Amory Lowell. He's now the first director, first trustee of the Lowell Institute, and he's trying to think what to do. So the first thing he did was talk to this gentleman. Professor Benjamin Silliman was a professor of geology and chemistry at Yale University. So Lowell goes down to Yale, talks to this guy, says, well, I will arrange lectures, and he sets up a scientific lecture series. And he was the first lecturer of the Lowell Institute. Now, what did that mean? He comes to Boston to give 10 lectures, expecting to attract 100 people. The Lowell Institute advertises that they're offering free lectures and with prominent people. To his astonishment, about 3,000 or 4,000 people apply for seats in the lecture hall. So many applied for seats that they had to cut the attendance in half, one half in the evening and another half in the following afternoon. So the Lowell Institute from the get-go attracted a tremendous number of people in a city of Boston then of about 80,000 people. So it's like 1 in 10 people was applying to attend the Lowell lectures, which I think is amazing. And as the Lowell lectures became more and more popular, as many as 8,000 or 10,000 people were applying for seats in the auditorium to listen to the lectures given on chemistry, on religion, on geology, on all manner of subjects. And in 1 year, as many as 170 separate lectures were given, which meant that the trustee had to locate and identify speakers, arrange travel arrangements, pay for them to come, house them, and to set up the auditoria to have the lectures, which took a tremendous amount of work. So this was an act of great devotion. So not only did John Amory Lowell have famous lecturers coming from abroad as well as from America to lecture, but he also organized lectures for common people involved in training people to work in the textile industry. And he began to combine his work as the trustee of the boot mill with designing textiles for cloth, as well as helping to run the Lowell Institute. These are names of people who are largely forgotten, but they were the intellectual heroes of the 19th century. One was Angus Grey, a professor at Harvard University. He became convinced that Darwin was correct, that there was an evolution of the species, and he argued accordingly. His great opponent was Louis Agassiz, who was a professor of anatomy at Harvard. The two of them had many arguments together. Agassiz believed that everything was ordained by God, that mosquitoes were mosquitoes because God wanted mosquitoes, and that rabbits were rabbits, and bunnies were bunnies, and cows were cows, and each one had a purpose ordained by a higher order, while other people argued in a process of evolution. And this became the great argument of the middle of the 19th century. And I would say that largely the evolutionists have won that argument, but at that time there were vicious arguments going on, and reputations were made and broken accordingly. One of the remarkable people of this time was Henry Rogers. He came from Pennsylvania. He was the son of a professor in Pennsylvania, and he had an ideal of setting up a technological institute. And he believed that the place to do it was in New England. So he wrote to John Amory Lowell and said, would Amory Lowell fund a technological school in New England that he would become the president of? And John Amory Lowell had the opportunity of funding a school that became the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But he refused to do it because he said it was beyond the scope of John Lowell Jr.'s will. But he gave it seed money to build the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which with Harvard are two of the world's greatest institutes of higher learning, both in the city of Cambridge. And in a sense, the Lowell industry was the mother of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, but it could have been the owner of the whole shebang if John Amory Lowell had played his, had enough historical perspective to make it that way. So this is MIT. It used to be in downtown Boston. It used to be on Boylston Street until about 1930 or so, when it moved across the river to its present location in Cambridge. But this is look, it became, the building on the right became a department store that I remember from 30 or 40 years ago. I don't know if it's still there, probably is, but it's no longer a department store. And these are the trolley lines running hither and yon. And the students were all mostly men, although they did accept women as well. Now, one of the speakers, of course, there was a young man called Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was then a young lawyer. And one of the consequences of the Lowell Institute was to make great reputations, and this is one. He wrote a book. One of the great benefits of the Lowell Institute lectures was not only that you got a good payment and you had a great audience, but that you could write a book, and the book was published as the Lowell Institute book. And he wrote a book on the basis of his Lowell Institute lectures that became one of the great legal textbooks of the 19th century. And this is him in his Civil War uniform. He was a colonel in the Union Army. His father, of course, was Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he was a professor of anatomy at Harvard Medical School, maybe the first professor of anatomy. And I think I'm correct in saying this, that the name Holmes, of course, was used by the writer of Sherlock Holmes, because Holmes Senior had got his education in Edinburgh, and his name was used in relation to Sherlock Holmes. Just a little aside of history. He didn't know that, of course, he was dead by then. John Amory Lowell was the trustee of the Lowell Institute for almost 50 years. When he died, his son Augustus Lowell became the trustee, and was not nearly as great as his father. He sort of followed in his father's footsteps, but he made sure that his children benefited from being lecturers at Lowell. So he allowed his son, Abbot Lawrence Lowell, and his daughter, Amy Lowell, the poet, to present Lowell lectures. And they became prominent lecturers and made their reputation as prominent academicians on the basis of the Lowell Institute. The third trustee of the Lowell Institute, of course, is Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the son of Augustus Lowell. And he was a lawyer who wrote a book about the governance of the governors in Great Britain and in Europe, and developed a reputation as being a serious academic. He was offered a position as lecturer at Harvard College and became a full professor. And in around 1806 or so, 1906, he was appointed the president of Harvard. So he used his savvy to combine his position as president of Harvard with the Lowell Institute by having programs crossing the two. Now, the two programs that come to mind, of course, are the Harvard Extension School that he had established using Lowell Institute money to establish the Harvard Extension School. And the other program he had was a school for what he called managers of industry, to train people in the sciences, in chemistry, in engineering, in electricity, in building maintenance, through MIT, trained by MIT professors and given a curriculum as intensive as that of first-year students at MIT. But these are people who would work in the daytime and come 3 times a week in the evening to do their training, and then became fairly prominent in the business world or running businesses in New England. And that went on for about 90 years until MIT closed it down, and that program went to Northeastern University, where it still exists to this day, although much diluted. So Abbot Lawrence Lowell is not one of my heroes. He was, I would describe him as an America firster. He believed that America should be a homogeneous country, that people should think alike, look alike, behave like him, act like him, have names like him, and was against people who came from abroad, particularly people who were poorly educated. He was in favor of people being only coming from Germanic countries or from Great Britain, and was against the immigration of people from Eastern Europe and people coming from Italy. So he was, and he was also against women entering Harvard College. So I would say he was a pretty conservative guy who, if he were alive today, would be a Republican and would sort of go along with some of the things that Trump would agree with on that spectrum of the. So he's a little out of favor these days because he was somebody who was against immigration of the masses, against people of diversity, and in favor of homogeneity. He believing that a country could only survive if it were homogeneous, and that all people, or most people, followed the same set of rules and obeyed whatever was given them, rather than the cantankerous America we have of our day. So that's Abbot Lawrence Lowell. This is him and President Theodore Roosevelt. He associated with the top strata of American life, people like himself. And he invited people to talk who were highly intellectual, European lecturers like Bertrand Russell, who came to Boston around 1907 and gave a series of lectures which no one could understand, perhaps not even himself. And he was very dissatisfied with the audience. He said they had no idea what he was talking about. But he was a pretty pompous guy, but one of his main sources of fame, other than winning a Nobel Prize, was that he was a pacifist and would not fight in World War I and was imprisoned by the British government. A guy well worth getting to know. The fourth trustee, how am I doing for time? Am I? Okay. The fourth trustee of the Lowell Institute is a pretty significant man called Ralph Lowell, who was a cousin of Abbot Lawrence Lowell. Abbot Lawrence Lowell had no children, so he appointed his cousin as the next trustee. And what this gentleman, Ralph Lowell, who was a great Bostonian, found out was that the interest in lectures had diminished appreciably. In around 1830, 1850, if you had a Lowell lecture, you could attract 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people who would come and sit quietly and listen, whether they understood it or not. It was the event of the week, of the end of the month. But by the middle of the 20th century, with the coming of the radio and the coming of the suburbia, people were losing interest in going into town to go to lectures. And the lectures were attracting 30 people, 40 people. So he said, it's not worth it anymore. Let's go with modernity. And he founded WGBH, which I think is a tremendous leap into the future of saying that people will listen to lectures providing they are on the air and they can listen from their homes rather than going to a lecture hall and sitting there coming from the suburbs and listening to a lecture. So he established WGBH, both WGBH radio and WGBH television, and Masterpiece Theatre was one of the ideas that came out of this. So I think for those of you or people here who live in the Boston area, I think you owe it to Ralph Lowell to bring the Lowell Institute into the modern era of radio and television, and to try to achieve the same result of instead of attracting 30 people, attracting 50,000 people on the air or on the TV. And this is what this gentleman did. And then when he died, his son took over, and his son's name was another John Lowell, who is the father of the present trustee of the Lowell Institute, William Amory Lowell, who was here when I gave my talk a couple of years ago. He's a lovely gentleman. He is the trustee of the Lowell Institute, and as Robert said earlier on, has seeded lecture series here at the Museum of Fine Arts, at the other parts of Boston, and sort of given, I think, a cultural lift to the city of Boston through lectures given through various organizations, and allowing people to listen to lectures much better than mine for free as a tribute to the Lowell Institute, which is almost 200 years old. It'll be that in about 10 or 12 years' time, which I think is a remarkable achievement. And that is the story of the Lowell Institute to date. And I have no doubt, a little doubt, that if I were to come here 50 years hence, it'll still be around, and perhaps even 100 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation, a fascinating man, and an amazing institution.
Thank you.
I have just a few questions for you, including one
I'm
from...
going to come closer to you to listen. Go ahead.
Oh. So Lowell's travels appear to have extended far beyond the ports that American merchants would have traveled to. So I'm interested in his travel diaries.
Yeah.
Can you say more about what his diaries discussed and how he remarked on the foreigners he met? What did his diaries talk about? Oh,
well, we've read his diaries when he was a sailor, and there's in the a library in Harvard they have a whole book about Lowell Travels when he was aged 18, 19, and all it consists of about the weather and the winds, and that's all it was. But when he went on this tour of Europe and Egypt, he wrote, as I said, probably 2,000 words a day. It's an incredible amount of writing, with acute observations of the places he saw, and his health, his ideas, the state of the world. And one thing that comes, here's one example. He was in Italy, and he was in Rome, and he saw the Tiber River, and he said, that's a pretty poor stream compared with our Merrimack River. So he'd make comparisons between what he saw abroad and what he remembered from the United States. He thought that the great countries of his time were Great Britain and France, but he said in a generation or two, the United States would be a partner become one of the great countries. So he saw the United States as a kind of country learning how to do things, but on its way to greatness. I was interested because I'm a psychiatrist by training in his mental status. What was he like? Was he depressed? Was he He wasn't. He was involved in looking out at the world. He would do very risky things. He had all kinds of illnesses of his eyes, of diarrhea, of typhoid, all kinds of things. And he would labor on medicating himself. He brought with him medications, which as far as I can tell were mostly alcohol and opium. And it may well be that he had become addicted to these drugs, although it wasn't known at the time. So he was trying to medicate himself. He was trying to keep going. He became so ill traveling in the daytime because of the intense heat that he would travel at nighttime. And he had pots of money. On one occasion, he was stopped by another traveler who said, "You must be the son of a king to travel so lavishly with a whole entourage of people." He said, "Oh no, in my country, in America, there are lots of people like me who are common people who can afford this sort of travel." Of course, it wasn't true. But he was one of the pioneer American travelers, and I think if somebody were bold enough to be able to read his stuff and to translate it and to modernize it as a travelogue of 19th century Europe, would make fascinating reading. And I think it was interesting. We labored because my wife was reading the stories by the hundreds and thousands of words, and I was trying to type the significant parts for my book. But it is a detailed story of European life in the 19th century, and also life in Egypt and in Turkey, that he captured, I think, with great feeling. And to add those to the picture, to the paintings that the Glier did, would make, I think, a very interesting book.
You mentioned his wealth. One of our viewers has done a little bit of research on the Lowell family and recalled that Lowell received $40,000 from his father when his father passed away.
Yeah.
And yet, 20 years later, when the Lowell Institute was established, his estate was worth $500,000.
Right.
And this gentleman was curious how that wealth could have grown so dramatically in that period of time.
Well, the official story is that he was a very acute businessman who made lots of money, but I think that's unlikely. I have a feeling, I don't know, that his wife was very wealthy. Now, where did she get her wealth from? The Amorys were merchants who were involved with the trade, how can I say this gently, of sugar and slavery in Cuba. And they were one of a number of New England families that didn't have slavery in New England, but they fostered slavery on the islands, on the Caribbean islands, Cuba, Haiti, and others like that. So my feeling is, I've not read this, but my feeling is that she had a lot of money, and the money passed to him when she died, and the money was largely based on sugar and cotton in the Caribbean islands worked by slaves. And there were, as I said, a few New Englanders who were engaged in offshore slavery, much the same way as the British were doing. They didn't have slavery in England, but they fostered slavery elsewhere. So that's where I think the money came from an inheritance from his father. And also when his brother died, because his brother and his sister died before him, and he may have gotten money from his brother who inherited from Francis Cabot Lowell. That's as far as I can make it out.
And of course, you've written a biography of his father.
Yes.
So now, having written extensively on both men, what do you think his father's greatest influence and mother's greatest influence was on him?
On John Lowell Jr.?
Yes.
Well, Francis Cabot Lowell said in a letter that he was disappointed by his son, that his son dropped out of Harvard. He didn't have the determination, the stick-to-itness, and that Francis Cabot Lowell set him up working for the Boot family as a clerk in the Boot family business. They were importers, exporters. And he paid the Boot family to have his son work there. So I think, and he said somewhere I read that his son had always been a disappointment to him, which is a pretty awful thing to say. But I think when Francis Cabot Lowell was a boy, his brother said the same thing about him. They were extremely, what shall I say, judgmental or expected perfection from each other, and if they didn't come up to the standards, they would be chastised. So to some extent, I can follow this sort of puritanical idea of you have to work hard, you have to succeed, you have to be ahead of the game, you have to be in front. Going back several generations, his grandfather, his father, and he and John Lowell Jr. Had the sense of being a failure until he got married, and then he got a second wind and began to establish a reputation, but got quickly deflated after having all these losses.
Well, what a legacy in the Lowell Institute, which through its speakers, the speakers to whom it gave visibility, its publications, its investments in other institutions, what an incredible legacy on American intellectual life and American education for nearly 2 centuries, as you know. What if John Lowell Jr. were alive today, what do you think he would be most excited about in the Lowell Institutes?
Well, let me answer this the following way. If he were alive in 1870, he would be thrilled beyond words, because his lectures, the Lowell lectures, were attracting thousands of people. They were famous throughout the world. They were attracting the leading intellectuals of the world, leading American intellectuals. If he had seen the Lowell Institute now, he would see it as a diminished thing, because adult education is such a humongous business now. When he founded his institute, there were maybe 10 universities in America, and the idea of educating the common person was to some extent remarkable. But I think it's become institutionalized in America, and there are thousands of universities. There are hundreds of teaching colleges. There are big funds like the the Ford Foundation and other foundations that have made the Lowell Institute kind of small. So I think how this gentleman, William Amory Lowell, he's not here, is he? How he can configure the Lowell Institute today to make it more than relevant, make it important, is a big job, because there's so much competition. There are, I think, 5,000 universities in America, some incredible, I don't know, but there are many thousand. So I would say it depends on but there have been a couple of trustees. I think Abbott Lawrence Lowell, who founded the Extension School, that's a big jump, and I think Ralph Lowell, who established WGBH. If I had the power, I would have a big exhibition at the Art Institute with all these pictures and all the sculptures, and to say this is what the Lowell family did. So that would be my choice. So I would say when I look at it this way, when you look at any business businesses don't last that long, maybe 10 years, 15 years. Restaurants come and go, companies come and go, Sears Roebuck comes and goes. And for an institute like the Lowell Institute to survive almost 200 years is pretty amazing. And it's all been done by 6 trustees. I mean, these 6 people in all this time have kept this thing afloat. So I think whatever it is about the Lowell Institute, the trustees have done a remarkable job.
They certainly have.
Yeah.
What a legacy of stewardship.
Yeah.
And I was thinking though, as I was listening to your talk about Ralph Lowell and WGBH, how the new media that the Lowell Institute has embraced has extended its reach in the same way that John Lowell Jr. traveled around the world and crossed geographic boundaries so easily.
Well, you know, I can absolutely, but here I am talking on I don't know how big an audience, but all the technology. And even for me, this is all kind of new stuff, you know. When I first gave a talk at this place, I talked with a microphone with people in front of me. So I think we all are heading in a different direction. The direction is of changes in technology. And I think so long as it's human, and so long as we touch people, it's worthwhile. But I would say, historically speaking, relevant for its time. And to switch from lectures to WGBH as an example is an astonishing foresight that made it possible to involve more and more people.
And I think a wonderful note to conclude on is your admonition to maintain that human connection. And I think that from what you have written of the Lowells and what we know about them, I think that that John Lowell Jr. and his family would agree.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. It's been a thrill to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's one of the highlights of my life to be in Lowell, in the Francis Cabot Lowell film, to talk about him and his son and his parents. So thank you so much.
And it's been our pleasure. Thank you very much. And everyone have a lovely evening.